So you've met Sonja and Mike. I hope you understand now why we thought it was a good idea to bring them in here to have a conversation with us. And Providence must have agreed, because with all the ice out there, the fact that their planes both got here on time, landed, and they were able to make the trip from Chicago to Springfield and be here on time is nothing short of miraculous. Let me also introduce you our third panelist. We're introducing Beth Purvis to join us. Beth is the new, her title is Secretary of Education. She is coming to this work with, God, I don't know, decades of experience across the branch. She's not only been the Director of Early Childhood Learning here in Illinois, but she's also served on the faculty of University of Illinois at Chicago. She has a degree in special education. She has worked with children with disabilities for 15 years before her role just before this, which is heading up the Chicago International Charter Schools, a network of charter schools in Chicago and actually beyond. So she's got an enormous amount of experience, which she practices, I'm sure, to their great joy and delight with on her two children back at home in Chicago. So Beth, thank you for joining us and rounding us out. So you all have paper and pens in front of you. You all know I'm not shy and I'll ask questions all night long, but you also know I'm very interested in what it is that's on your mind. So please, write down a letter. We've got a number of people circulating, and they'll bring them up to me, and I will weave them into discussion as well. But let me start. You've given us a lot to think about. And I want you to know that we had invited Sonja and Mike many months ago. So the fact that we're in the middle of a very lively conversation about Park is not entirely surprising. But their timing here, obviously, we planned this a while ago. And I explained to them there's a lot of current discussion and activity about that. So let me start with this. So, Sonja, you've told us a little bit about why Park is different. You know, we're in the middle of transitioning. In fact, I think the testing is starting. New students are sitting down in front of Park. I think it's fair to say that there is a non-trivial amount of anxiety that everybody has. Students have, that parents have, that teachers have, that administrators have. And you explained to us what some of the differences are and why it matters and why you think it's helpful. But can you also go, there is discussion, and Mike touched on this a little bit. You know, should we take a pass on that this year? Should we wait till the kinks are worked out in the test? Should we pull and if we didn't as a state choose to do that, should we pull our kids out for a year? Can you share, that is a live conversation, not only here but elsewhere. Can you give us some thoughts, take us the next step in your discussion and give us some thoughts on that?
Sure, so, and I actually get asked this question a lot in terms of opting out, and does it, you know, why would you or would you not? And I think the real answer for me is we need a representative population of kids to know how well we're doing, right? And the opting out doesn't change the fact that we still need to know whether kids are doing well, right? We need to know where they are, and Mike did touch on this, that the temperature check, we cannot be afraid that it's not going to look right. And I think if we go back to, for example, I was in Massachusetts when Massachusetts switched standards, and it was scary for folks. It was scary. People didn't know how kids were going to do. They didn't know whether it was too hard. And I will tell you that if we all know that this first round is a benchmark round, right? It's to set the baseline. It's not a judgment on our schools, our teachers, and our kids for forever. It's setting where we start, right? And so, and I will just say, true confession, my daughter is hopefully in the bed if my husband got in her bed. She's sitting for the Park tomorrow. So in Maryland, at third grade, Park, she's taking the test tomorrow. And I think part of the responsibility we have as leaders, and I say that as a former school leader, as a teacher leader, district leader, national leader, is we have the responsibility to let people know that this is a benchmark year, that we're setting the baseline, that there are no final judgments. In my daughter's school, she did not come home throwing up. She did not come home in tears. And some of that is because her teachers, her principal, her parents told her, it's a test. Let's see how we do. Let's get the information, and then we know where to go from here. And I think if we let people know that we're not here to condemn, right? We're not here to give a life sentence to children. We're here to take a temperature check as a community, as a nation, to know then how we move forward. So opting out, and I get this, again, I get this question a lot, it doesn't help us get the real sense we need. And that's why we need everybody there. We need everybody participating so that we get a real sense of the direction we need to go in.
So, Beth, you're 11 days in this new position. So I think it's fair of me to ask you a complicated and substantive question. That is more than enough time. You've got a big brain.
I'm ready.
So we're here talking about closing gaps. Illinois, and I know everybody in the room knows this, but let me remind you that we have the distinction of having some of the worst achievement gaps by race, some of the worst achievement gaps by income of any state in the country. And while we have made some gains of late generally in our achievement and our graduation rates, which is important and huge and significant, with very few exceptions, we have not started to really see closing those gaps. As you come into this new position and this new way of tackling the world of education, which I know you care about, how important is closing gaps as opposed to just sort of generally working on making things better? Why is that an important, or in your mind, not an important focus?
Well, I think it's very important, but I think we're asking the wrong question when we talk about achievement gaps. And I think both Sonja and Mike touched on this. We need to close the college readiness gap, and we need to close the workforce readiness gap. And again, if we're creating schools for our kids, not for other people's kids, which I think both of the panelists said much more eloquent than myself, we need to think about the goal of education is to prepare students for career and citizenship. And we need to focus on having kids to have the skills and content knowledge they need to be prepared for college, to be prepared for the workforce. And we need to focus, again, on our students who are coming to school not ready in kindergarten or not ready in high school. And we need to ensure that we are focused on supporting our teachers and supporting our principals and our administrators in having the resources they need to be successful with these kids. And one of those things is having the data to be able to make informed decisions. And using that data also to make informed decisions on what we're spending. So I think we also need to look at, in closing these achievement gaps, in where are our students starting, what are the data that we can have so that we can ensure that instruction is focused on their needs, but also to make sure that teachers have the professional development that they need, that administrators have the ability to spend their precious dollars on what each individual child needs or on what groups of children need.
I love that you mentioned resources, because that allows me, Mike, to ask you a two-part question. The first is, how much does, I mean, there's a raging debate, right? I mean, some people are like, look, it's about just doing better with what we've got, and other folks who are like, no, money is really the answer, we're starving. How important, forget, you know, the adequacy, equity conversation, just generally, how important is money to the problems that we're talking about, to closing the achievement gap? How significant an issue is that on its own, as opposed to doing some of these other things, tightening up standards, making sure that we've got more equitable expectations and strategies?
So you know, in the question of, you know, is it about more money, or is it about how you spend it? I think the answer is yes. You know, and so I think for us, we did two things. One is we felt like we had to do a lot of the work around improving the efficacy of where we invested dollars before we looked to expand the number of dollars that came in. So we felt like we had a real public trust building to do with our taxpayers in our state to say, hey, listen, we're going to first show you that we're spending every single tax dollar we have right now the most effectively we can, that you know that we're accountable for them, you know where they're spent, how they're spent, you know we have standards, we have accountability, we have assessments, that will build a framework that will allow you to be informed, and that we'll also do a really deliberate job of identifying places that are doing really great work with that money and working to replicate those investments. And so I have weird feedback, is that just me?
It's okay.
Maybe it's my phone. It's better, worse, better. Okay. And so I think we try to look at both what we can do to tighten the efficacy of the system as it currently exists, what we can do to make sure we know where dollars go and how effective they are, and then looking at where are the places where dollars are really making a big impact. What we find is there are some places that have the same amount of dollars that are getting vastly different results. And we also find there are a lot of different ways to generate resources. One of the things that we tackled that I know you all are looking at here is when you look at what the formula is for how much local districts contribute their part to the state formula. In Colorado, it's wildly disparate. So if you lived in the district where I was principal, on a $200,000 house, you would pay 30% property tax. You pay 30% mill levy, a 30 mill levy rate. If you owned a $200,000 house in Aspen, if that existed, if you owned a $200,000 bathroom in Aspen, you would pay 2% property tax on that same piece of property. And so what we found is our lowest income districts are taxing themselves at the highest possible rates and still getting the least amount of state support to match that investment, and it's just a game they can never catch up with. I sat in an event at a home in Aspen with one of our rural superintendents who said, the value of this house is more than the entire property base of my district. And so I can add 500 mills onto the property base in my district and not get to what's possible in other districts. And so I think that through no evil intent, we've backed into a scenario where there are lots of ways to make that formula more equitable without having to raise taxes, but my belief is that you needed to do both. We needed to both make the funding more equitable and try to secure more resources.
I'm going to come back to that, but we have an interesting question. Sonja, I'm going to bring to you. If this is truly a benchmark year, is it a good idea, bad idea? What are your thoughts? One of our questioners is asking, should the results be kept quieter? I mean, should they be kept at the district level, not shared publicly, really be used in a more internal fashion? Thoughts on that?
Another question. It's nice to know that Illinois follows the country in some of your questions, so I thank you for that. I do think that we have a responsibility to parents, for parents to know where their young people are. I don't think it actually helps the cause of districts to not have that information public. I think it actually helps. And as a former district person, I will tell you this, I would not want to be the only one with that data, because I want everyone to own where we are. It is not just my responsibility, it's the community's responsibility. And so having that public lets everybody see where we really are. Now, yes, does the district own responsibility for charting the plan in terms of the role of schools and everything else? But I will tell you, when I was in Baltimore City, we were very clear with the mayor's people. We were very clear with our State Department of Ed. You are not leaving us floating in the sauce, right? We are all in this together. And in order to do that, I think it is best for that information to be public. And we owe it to the communities that we serve. We are not hiding anything. This is where we are. Let's all get in and roll up our sleeves together.
Let me follow that up. This is not part of it. I am now ad-libbing shamelessly. But let me follow up, because I suspect one of the thrusts is that it's scary.
It is.
I mean, I think the only thing that all of us can be sure about is two things. One, scores are going to go down, probably closer to where we've been on NAEP. And two, it's going to be bumpy. You can't make a transition this big to a whole brand new instrument without that happening. And if we could lower anxiety by keeping it quiet, would your thinking still hold? Have you balanced that in the, just getting, sort of letting people dip their toes into the water?
I just don't think that hiding student achievement results in the end gets you the distance you think it's going to get you. And I do think that there's a way of sharing at a local level. And again, look, you all know your context, but I will just tell you, I think it is more in how we communicate and what we do with the data than in keeping the data quiet. In most cases, when it blows up at a school level or at a district level, it's because people were not prepared along the way. And frankly, at the ground level, we weren't doing what we needed to do to support people and take cover. In Massachusetts, when the scores came out, it wasn't hidden. But we had leaders in every sector who did not leave teachers alone to message. We had from the governor's office to local representatives to members of the business community, everyone was out communicating. And I think it's more in communication and preparation than it is about keeping things quiet.
Which actually went, when we raised the ISAT, folks will recall that actually, you know, I think went a lot better than folks expected. Let me talk about another question which I think is very top of mind. Shifting to new standards, as well as new assessments, and I don't know who quite wants to take the first crack at this, requires a lot of time. And I think everybody would agree, whenever there are conversations, and I am sure that you are hearing this every part of the country, how are we do not do a great job about finding teachers and school personnel the time that they need to really thoughtfully plan for that. And so I would ask this in two ways. Mike and Sonja, what are you seeing that other districts or states have done that we can or should consider? Beth, this has to be on your mind. Are there some, you know, break the mold ideas that we ought to be looking at, or that we would be prepared to look at in Illinois to try and really free up radically more time than we currently have? It's a simple question, so I know.
So I agree totally. So this is, I mean, when I visit classrooms and talk to teachers, this is always the first thing I hear is, we want to do this, we want to do it well, but it requires more time. And if you look at, there's a lot of debate about international comparisons of American performance to other countries and about the systems in those countries. One seldom noted comparison to places like Finland is if you look at, I remember as principal, we have a 1,080 hour school year. And in America, for most teachers in a 1,000-hour school year, you are feet on the floor teaching around 800 of those hours. In Finland and comparison countries, it's around 400 or 500 hours. So it literally is almost 50% of the schedule is planning time versus instructional time. And so we're working on two things. One is, can you extend the amount of contact time for kids? Because we also know kids need more support to close the gaps.
Because kids are not home during that remaining time, to be clear.
Oh, that's right. That's right. No, kids are in.
Don't want anybody under that impression.
These are similarly long school days. It's just it means different staffing structures to allow adults more planning time while students still have contact time. So we're working on two things. One is extending the amount of school time for students, longer school days and school years. And the second is pairing that with extended amounts of planning time for teachers. And we are in a budget crisis too, and we actually are the only state in the country that has a constitutional amendment that prevents the legislature from increasing revenues, so we couldn't provide more revenues if we wanted to. We have to go to the voters every time we want to do that, and that's never in Colorado history passed. And so we, by definition, have to figure out how to do more with the same. And so what we're looking at is there are some innovative strategies for how you think about a rush hour shift at a lunch restaurant, right? You have someone who does a 8 to 12 shift and someone who does a 10 to 2 shift. You overlap on the 10 to 12 spot, so there's more people on the floor. We're looking at creative staffing structures to try to extend the number of hours that students see instruction, while also extend the amount of planning time teachers can have, and we think there are some exciting models to do it.
Beth, anything you want to add?
So I'm sure there are people in this room who have better ideas than I do about this, and I think that's part of the thing that we need to do, is we need to look at the data when it comes out, look at those schools that are performing the highest, and ask those teachers and administrators what they did to create the time for their teachers to understand how to implement the standards with fidelity and see the growth within their own schools. And I think although we talk about a lot about the schools that are struggling in this state, there are also many schools that are performing very well. And I think when the tests come out, there will be some schools, I have great hope and great faith, that will perform very well. And I think we need to look at the field and look where where we are seeing good outcomes. And I think we can also look at currently, I think of the teacher incentive grants that were out that looked at different staffing pattern and teachers doing coaching of other teachers within their classroom. And I think if we look at some of those models that we know work for all improving of practice and apply that here, I think we'll see great improvement both in student learning but in teachers in their own craft.
So let me, an interesting related, and Mike, it picks up on a point you just made, but any of you to answer this. What role can a community and social services organization, and that, part of all communities, what role can they play in supporting Park? What role can they play in helping children? Is there a role for sort of broadening, who's responsible for that for the day as we structure it for kids.
Can I jump in for 1 second
Sure.
before that? I think part of it is and I look at the list of different groups and representatives we have here, is we need to have honest conversations. We need to have honest conversations about where we're failing, where kids are failing, and what we can do to improve the situation and to improve outcomes for kids. And I think the best thing about what has occurred in the last few weeks around Park is that there have been some really honest and hard conversations about the pros and the cons. And if we are not willing to have those really hard conversations, we are not going to change anything.
So I'd add to this, I'm very excited about this issue because we're working on this right now. And again, people think data is like so boring and oppressive. This is the excitement for me as a school principal or community leader. So what we're looking at is, suppose you are a middle school teacher who has 5 kids in the 7th grade who are really struggling with reading, right? And you also have 3 kids who are depressed and 2 kids who have family tumult going on at home, and you are overwhelmed by all that, and how can you get support? We have at the same time in our communities all these amazing nonprofits and community networks that are doing after-school support, reading, tutoring, mentoring. Do we have, as a principal, any information that tells us which one of these 15 after-school tutoring programs are actually most helpful in getting a kid to learn how to read, or most helpful in getting a first-generation Spanish-speaking immigrant who hasn't yet mastered English to learn how to read? The opportunity for us to say, we now not just have data on how the schools do, our nonprofits are fighting to get access to the school data and to share their own data, so we can be in a pool where now as a teacher I could say, okay, this 7th grader that has needs, I know here are the 4 programs in our neighborhood, and here's the one that based on evidence is probably best for her, and I can connect her right away to that service in a seamless way that says, hey, we all have a role to play here. No one's saying that Superwoman or Superman teacher is going to fix all of this, but the ability to better align the information we have and better provide services together means you get folks rowing in the right direction and not in the wrong direction. We have 2 high schools in my district. One of them has 19 independent mentoring programs going after school right now. One has 0. When the next nonprofit comes to the next funder and says they want to add the 20th mentoring program at that high school, someone should say no. Or someone should say, have you thought of the high school down the road? And someone should say, of the 19 we have, which ones are doing a great job and how do we partner with them more? And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity here for expanding the network of who does this work and us doing it together. I just think that more information is going to be better if we're going to do it well.
One of the things I heard as a theme in both Sonja and Mike, your remarks, is the importance of digging deep and staying with things. That where you see real change is not just superficial things and then on to the next, but this is the work, this is what needs to be done, and we're just going to keep at it until it's done through thick, through thin. That's not so easy to do. And to stay with things when you've got changes in administration, when you've got changes in sort of the political landscape, when you've got changes in financial fortunes, at really, literally at every level of the work, school, district, on up to the state, politically as well as administratively. How do you carry through that? What are the strategies? What's the advice? I actually think Illinois has been remarkable in its ability to make some decisions and really just plug away, right? Non-sexy, just plug away and keep doing it. And Audrey and I were talking earlier, like particularly good about continuing to talk even when issues get hard and complex. But, you know, we got a long way still to go. I mean, for your analogy, Mike, I don't know which day of driving we're on, but we're in those early days. And what's the trick? What's the secret? What have you seen? What's your advice?
I feel distinctly unqualified to answer this question because we have not figured this out yet. We haven't figured out the outcome. We haven't figured out the process. And I think the process is we want our decisions to be informed by evidence. And so what we want to do, you know, as a principal, you know, so I ran the bill to change our statewide principal and teacher evaluation system to link 50% of principal and teacher evaluations to student growth. There are some folks who think that's way too much, some who think it's way too little, some who think it's the end of the world as we know it, some who think it's the salvation of the world as we know it, and they're all probably wrong. And so there's been pushes to say, why don't, you know, before we start, let's cut it to 20%, or let's grow it to 70%, or let's make it to 10%. And I think that what we're trying to do is saying, let's implement this and gather information really carefully and honestly from the field about what's working and what's not working. And then let's make reasoned adjustments based on the information. But to be able to say, let's stop doing this before we gather reliable information, to me, I think is irresponsible. But I think the other thing that's irresponsible is to ideologically defend one position because it's the position that I took 5 years ago, right? So as a principal, you never sit down with your faculty and design a new student intervention plan and then implement it and lock yourself in the office for the next year and say, I sure hope it worked.
Though it's tempting.
Yeah, it is tempting. What you do is you implement it, and then you sit down in the next faculty meeting and say, what'd you think? What were the unintended consequences we didn't see? What are the things we can fix and improve? But I think we're in that stage now where we need to do this full, faithful implementation to see what works and what doesn't. I think if you don't, you risk really damaging the data. So I had a law school professor who used to say, the purpose of a prosecutor and a defense attorney is it's like you and your best friend trying to get home and you both disagree on the path. Like, if I agree to walk course A and you agree to walk course B and we both walk them fairly, we'll see who gets home first. If halfway there I decide that my path is lame and just cut over and meet you, we'll never actually know what the data suggested about which of these two routes are more effective. And so I think we need a clear and kind of an uninterrupted set of data from which to make decisions before we start making mid-course corrections.
I would also add that I do think that I think communication matters. And I think that in places where the course is being maintained, people at all levels, regardless of who the stakeholders are, feel as if that there's a level of transparency, there's a level of honesty, and there's an openness to actually hear the mid-course corrections. When folks begin to think that the ground is shaking at every point, quite frankly, I can't blame them for considering whether we're really dedicated to it or not, and I think being real clear about who the champions are. And I know that sounds corny or whatever, but I do think people watch. They watch to see who's gonna buckle. And even if leaving office is one thing, but changing your mind too quickly, as Mike was saying, I mean, of course we have to adjust, sends a signal in its own right. And when a lot of the rancor was beginning in Maryland around, is this where we want to go? Is this what we want to do? I had 4 teachers come up to me in the supermarket, and they said, Dr. S., if you tell us you're going to stay the course and you think this is right, then we're on board. But we're watching you. We're actually not watching all the time everyone else. And I think people have the folks that they watch, and I think that's why it's important at every level of investment. So from the teacher-leader level, there are teachers who could care less what I think, but they watch to see the people they respect, and do they believe that that this is really the right direction. So I think we can't underestimate the power of having champions at every segment of this work and this race.
Let me ask one last question, and then I'm going to wrap us, because several questions have come in, and it's sort of the nature of the conversation we're having tonight that it didn't get addressed as directly, and so I think folks are interested in early childhood. And in the scheme of things, as you're figuring out where to make investments, where does that fit in the priorities when you've got limited resources? What role did it play when you were having those conversations in Colorado, particularly around funding? But just talk a little bit about how that factors into the big picture.
Tremendously important, and we're not funding it well. So this is we don't offer even full-day kindergarten in Colorado. We only offer half-day kindergarten. So literally, if you are a student who can pay for a half-day tuition, then at noon the bus comes and picks up the kids who can't pay and takes them home, and the kids who can stay a full day. It's pretty horrendous. So we're trying to roll it down to 3 and 4 year olds as well. And yet we don't have money we're $1 billion in the hole from our K-12 funding, and we can't recover that because of the restriction on increased revenue. So what we're trying to do is find creative approaches to figure out how to fund early childhood education. The one that I'm working on this year is a proposal around social impact bonds or pay for success financing, which is a system that that Chicago has tried. Many may be familiar with it, but it's a structure by which we allow philanthropic or nonprofit investors to pay upfront investment in early childhood education. And you probably all know the Frederick Douglass aphorism, it is cheaper to build healthy children than to repair broken men. But as you know, we don't finance public services that way. So what this does is allows us to put upfront investment into early childhood. When 3 or 4 years later, we see that that investment has manifested itself in decreased expenditures on things like special ed referrals, literacy interventions, READ Act support, which is for students who are behind grade level. The money that is saved from that avoided cost we use to pay back the upfront investors, so it's only paid when the state has met its outcomes. And so this is one creative way we're trying to look for to fund early childhood, because we think it's so important, and yet we don't have the dollars to expand funding to K-12, to early childhood, when we can't yet fund K-12. So that's our intermediate plan.
I would only add that the gains are seen when it is both expansion and attention to quality. Just expanding will not get the bump. There has to be a commitment to quality and not just increasing numbers.
There's a whole other conversation about the work in Maryland on kindergarten readiness, so we'll get to that in another year. Yeah, Beth.
And I wanted to add, I think this is a place where Illinois is leading. And when we look right now, we actually have an objective rating of early childhood programs in the Accelerate program. And so I think that's a place where we can talk about quality of early childhood programs, talk about early childhood options, and it could be a place where both K-12 and higher ed could look towards a quality rating system.
Please join me in thanking Mike and Beth and Sonja for spending their evening with us. I think I offered to eat my hat or some other, item of clothing if you did not find them riveting and interesting. So you'll come up to me later, but I think I'm safe. But, and I don't think I ever introduced myself. For those who don't know me, I'm Robin Staines. I'm Executive Director of Advance Illinois, and I really want to thank a few folks. First of all the folks who have co-hosted this. It's too long a list for me to reread. You want to get home and skate your way on the ice. But really appreciate and love that this is something that we've now done for 4 years. But I think I want to save my biggest thanks for, I'm really struck. I was going to use a different story, and I'm not going to tell it. I'm just going to shamelessly steal, Mike, yours. We are in the early days of driving, but I think there are a lot of thanks to legislative leaders and legislators who have picked up car keys and who have got us in cars. You've made some really tough decisions. You've been willing to wrestle with some hard issues, which are not easy to do in the political domain. And the fact that you've got us in cars and we've got those keys, I think, is enormous, and it's huge, and you deserve a huge round of thanks for that. I mean that. But there are a lot of drivers in this room, and I think maybe even more importantly, there are a lot of drivers around the state who are teaching kids in classrooms every day, who are principals, who are superintendents, who are school board members. And we've got a number of those drivers in the room. Would all the school administrators and teachers stand? Please, I know you're shy. I mean, the rest of us can talk about it, but there isn't anybody who has spent a day in a classroom who doesn't know you've got both the most wonderful and interesting job with the best stories to tell of any of us, but also the hardest and one of the most intellectually and emotionally demanding. But there are other drivers in this room, and I want to also ask those folks who work at the State Board of Education and in the higher ed education, the community colleges, the Board of Higher Ed, and ISAC to also stand, because you guys have an unbelievably thankless job to do, because it's your job to make this work stick. You do it with too few staff, you do it with too few resources, you keep your sense of humor for the most part. I don't know how that happens. Anybody who's ever spent a minute with Chris, raise your hand if, I mean this seriously, raise your hand if you've ever spent a minute with Chris and he has not smiled. It's inconceivable. Honestly, the man should be frowning almost all the time and he never does. So, that's the kind of commitment. I mean, and it's interesting because for those of you who joined us last year, Massachusetts has been a remarkable success story. And what you heard Paul Revel, who was one of the architects of that, say is, it mattered that you stick with it. You've got to get the foundations right. You've got to put the money behind it. And then you've got to stay the course. So I hope you're all inspired to do that you are fortified with the right amount of food and drink to do that. The bar, I think, is still open. Thank you so much for joining us on a very unfriendly and hostile weather evening. Have a very good evening.